In this video, I'm going to show you a new and improved way of solving quadratic equations. You no longer have to use the quadratic formula or completing the square. Of course, if you see the factorization, that's always the easiest. But what if you don't see it? Well, Dr. Po-Shen came up with a new way, very clever way of solving these quadratic equations. Brilliant person, check out his YouTube channel. Now, what Dr. Lowe saw was that if you have the factorization, let's start backwards, equals 0. Well, if you multiply this out, you get x squared minus x1 plus x2 plus x1 times x2. Oops, times x. The coefficient of x after the minus sign, that's the sum of the roots. And the constant is the product of the roots. Well, let us look at the middle. So let's suppose x1 is less than x2. The average right in the middle will be x1 plus x2 over 2. Now, since this is the middle, this distance and that distance will be the same. Let's call them d for distance. Well, in this case, x1 will be the midpoint minus d, while x2 will be the midpoint plus d. Now, if you think about this, we know what the average is because you can read off their sum, just divide by 2. So if we can find d, that would be it. Just take the average and take away d and add d. Well, we know one more thing. If you take x1, which is that, and you multiply it by x2, which is that, you're going to get x1, x2. And basically, this is what you need to use to figure out the roots. Because this will help you get d, and then all you do is you take the average of the roots, take away d, and add d. So let us look at a concrete example. Suppose you have x squared minus 9x plus 14. You have x1 here and x2 here. Well, that's the coefficient in front of x after the minus sign. So the average will be 9 over 2. So x1 will be 9 over 2, 9 over 2 minus d. And x sub 2 is 9 over 2 plus d. Well, their product, 9 over 2 minus d, that's x1, times 9 over 2 plus d, that's x2. x1 times x2, oops, this should say equals 0. x1 plus x2 is 14. Well, if I multiply those two factors out, I get 9 over 2 squared minus d squared equals 14. That is 81 over 4 minus d squared is, well, let's multiply by 4 over 4, so we'll have common denominators. And we get 56 over 4. Interchange those numbers, and you get 81 over 4 minus 56 over 4 is d squared. So d squared is, looks to me like 25 over 4. Now d was defined to be distance. So we're not going to have plus minus. D is always positive. So d would be the square root of 25, which I like to write that way, divided by the square root of 4, which is 2. So now we're done. x1 was the midpoint minus 5 over 2, which is 4 over 2 or 2. And x sub 2 is the midpoint, the average of the two roots, plus 5 over 2, which is 14 over 2 or 7. That problem is done. Let's try another one. Suppose you have x squared plus 5x plus 7 equals 0. First, understand that that 5 is understood to be positive. And understand that you can change addition to subtraction as long as you change the sign of the second number. So you get x squared minus negative 5x plus 7 equals 0. So the midpoint will be negative 5 over 2. And x1 will be to the left of the midpoint. It'll be d units to the left. And x2 will be d units to the right. So x1 is this value, take away d. And x2 is also that value, negative 5 over 2. But this time, we're going to add d to get to x2. And since this is x1 times x2, it has to equal 7. So we have this number squared, which is 25 over 4, minus d squared. That's what you do when you get the difference of squares. Get a squared minus b squared. And this is 7, which is 28 over 4. And we interchange those two numbers. So you have 25 over 4 minus 28 over 4 is equal to d squared. That is negative 3 over 4 is equal to d squared. So d is, now think of negative 3 as negative 1 times 3. You get the square root of 3. You'd get the square root of 4, which is 2, times the square root of negative 1, which is I. Once you get d, you're done. You take that midpoint, which was that, so x1 is negative 5 over 2 minus the square root of 3r over 2. And x sub 2 will be negative 5 over 2 plus the square root of 3 over 2i. Of course, you can write them down in shorthand. It's going to be the center, the midpoint, plus or minus d. It's always that. So you can write your answer that way or your answer that way. So we did one example where we had two real roots. We just did one where you have two complex roots. Let's do one where you get double roots. Suppose you have x squared minus 4x plus 4 equals 0. So there's the minus in front of the x term. So the midpoint between x1 and x sub 2 will always be that number over 2. Well, 4 divided by 2 is 2. Okay, so that's d. So x1 is going to be 2 minus d, and x sub 2 is going to be 2 plus d. So all you do is you take half of that number, take away d, add d, and then set it equal to 4, the constant. Well, this gives us 2 squared minus d squared equals 4. Well, you should know what to take away from 4 to get back to 4. And that answer is 0. So d squared is 0, which means d is 0. So x1 is 2 minus d, or 2. And x sub 2 is 2 plus d, but d is 0, which is 2. So there are your two answers. You want to do it in one step. You get 2 plus or minus d, which happen to be 0. But that's also 2. If you have 2 and you add 0, you get 2. If you have 2 and you take away 0, you get 2. Now, I do want to say that this method only works if the leading coefficient is 1. Well, if you have, say, 2x squared plus 4x plus 7 equals 0, well, the first thing you should do is divide by 2. And then you'll get x squared plus 2x plus 7 halves equals 0. And you can have plus, so you change it to subtraction, and you change the sign of that understood positive 2x to negative 2x plus 7 over halves. So that's the sum. Well, if you take negative 2 and you divide it by 2, you get negative 1. That means the average is negative 1. Okay, so we need to find out what d is. x1 is negative 1 minus d, and x sub 2 is negative 1 plus d. And this is supposed to equal to the constant, 7 over 2. Please take the constant when you have the 1. Don't take the constant from the original equation that didn't have a 1 in front. Do not use that constant. No. Okay, so you get negative 1 squared minus d squared equals 7 over 2. So 1 minus d squared is 7 over 2. You can think of the 1 as 2 over 2. Interchange those two values. You get 2 over 2 minus 7 over 2 is d squared. 2 minus 7 is negative 5 over 2 equals d squared. So d is going to be the square root of 5 divided by the square root of 2 times the square root of negative 1, which is I. If you want, you can multiply top and bottom by square root of 2. That gives us a rational number in the denominator. And then the square root of 5 times the square root of 2 is the square root of 10i. So that's d. So x1 is the midpoint plus the square root of 10i over 2. But in anticipating this, we can say 2 over 2 for negative 1. Or negative 2 over 2. So you get negative 2. I need to change something. Get negative, well, I guess I have to change it now. x1 should be the center minus d. So you get negative 2 minus the square root of 10i over 2. And x sub 2 will be negative 2 over 2 plus the square root of 10i over 2. So x2 would be negative 2 plus the square root of 10i over 2. And there are your two answers. Just find the value for d. That's all you need to do. That's the whole job in this, is to find out what d is. How much is d? How much is d? The midpoint is easy. Once you have a 1 in front of the x squared, all you have to do is take half of that number. It better be after a minus sign. Taking half of a number is also equivalent to dividing by 2. And that center minus d and that center plus d is supposed to equal to the constant, 7 over 2. I squared both sides. Sorry. I multiplied this side. I multiplied this by that. And I got this. And I still set it equal to 7 over 2. Hope you like this new method. If you like math like this, where we show usually proofs, but this was also a proof, but it was also a new technique. Subscribe to my channel. Let your friends and family members know about what we do here and have them subscribe. See you guys in the next video, and please watch and learn.